Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. It is the final day of April 1945. Berlin trembles beneath the thunder of Soviet artillery, each shell shaking dust loose from the battered concrete walls of the Führer bunker. Once imagined as a fortress of command, the bunker is now a tomb for dreams of empire. In its corridors, the fluorescent lights flicker, illuminating maps that no longer matter, lines drawn across a continent already consumed. Adolf Hitler, once a figure whose words electrified millions, now slumps in a chair. His voice, hoarse and weakened, carries no trace of the ferocity that once echoed across stadiums. He mutters about betrayal, about cowardice, Feiglinge, cowards, damning the German people themselves for failing him. His tirades no longer ignite fear or obedience, only a dull, suffocating despair among those trapped with him. Among them stands Lieutenant General Hans Bauer, Hitler's loyal pilot, who had ferried him countless times through the skies of a collapsing Europe. With quiet desperation, Bauer makes one final offer: to escape. He speaks of Argentina, of Japan, even the deserts of the Middle East, anywhere but here. A plane waits, and with it, the faintest thread of survival. Yet Hitler shakes his head. His mind, bound by delusion and fatalism, refuses. He will not flee, he says. If Germany is to fall, he will fall with it. The room falls into silence. The stale air presses heavily on the chest, as if the weight of all Europe's suffering has gathered in these concrete chambers. Officers and secretaries exchange brief glances. No one speaks aloud the truth, but all know it. The war is lost. The Reich is finished. Their leader has chosen death. Above ground, Berlin is in ruins. Buildings smolder, streets are filled with rubble, and entire neighborhoods lie flattened. The thunder outside is relentless, Soviet artillery closing in. The men and women below can almost feel the Red Army advancing step by step, their presence more real than the words of any commander. Yet even in these final hours, Hitler clings to fragments of fantasy. He orders non-existent armies to maneuver, divisions that exist only in his imagination. Maps are shifted, lines redrawn, but every officer present knows the truth. Those units are gone. Their men either dead, surrendered, or swallowed by the tide of refugees streaming westward. The silence after each order is unbearable, broken only by the scratching of pencils on paper, as aides pretend to write down commands that will never be carried out. Outside the bunker, the city is bleeding. Families cower in cellars, children cry in the smoke-choked darkness, and the streets echo with both defiance and despair. The once proud capital of the Reich has become a hollow shell, awaiting the final blow. And here, in the earth beneath it, the man who brought Europe to ruin faces his end, not with thunder, but with whispers. The last days in the bunker are not the story of a leader. They are the story of collapse, of illusions shattering, of a people abandoned by the very figure who once demanded their devotion. The world above is already writing the conclusion in fire and steel. Down here, the only question that remains is when the silence will fall. Before the final Soviet push, Berlin was a city already on its knees. Once a metropolis of 4.3 million people, it now held barely 3 million souls, many of them women, children, and the elderly. Every day was a struggle to survive, not just the war outside the walls, but the war inside their stomachs. Bread was scarce, potatoes scarcer still. Rations shrank to thin soups, watery stews, and scraps that could not sustain bodies already worn thin from 6 years of conflict. Air raid sirens had become the city's cruel soundtrack. By the end of 1944, British and American bombers turned night into fire. Families carried their lives in baskets and bags, descending into the choking, overcrowded shelters beneath the city. Down there, air was hot and stale, candles guttered against damp walls, and whispers carried more quickly than laughter. Some prayed, some cursed, and some simply waited in silence as the ground trembled above them. By Christmas of 1944, morale in Berlin had collapsed. The festive spirit was a hollow memory, shops empty, windows shattered, bells silenced. Only the most fanatical clung to Hitler's promises, chanting slogans in a voice that sounded more desperate than confident. For most Berliners, the war no longer felt like an epic struggle for a 1,000-year Reich. It was merely survival until tomorrow. And yet, for all the terror of Allied air raids, the city's people feared something else far more: the East, the Soviets. Everyone had heard the stories, in whispers between families, in letters from fleeing relatives, in rumors that spread like wildfire. The Red Army was portrayed not just as an army, but as an approaching storm of vengeance. Still, life persisted, if only in fragments. A few trams rattled across broken tracks. Children scavenged bricks from ruins, stacking them into games that resembled fortresses. Women queued for hours in the cold for ration cards that promised little. Even in destruction, Berlin's heartbeat refused to die completely. Yet every rumble of artillery from the distance reminded them that time was running out. The city was not only shrinking in numbers, but in spirit. The Berlin of cabaret, of cinema, of crowded cafes and streetcars was gone. In its place stood a city of ruins and shadows, waiting for the inevitable knock at its eastern door. For Berliners, the air raids from Britain and America were terrifying, but they carried a strange kind of familiarity. The whine of sirens, the distant hum of engines, the crash of bombs, all of it was part of a rhythm they had come to expect. But the East was different. The Soviets inspired something deeper, darker, and more primal: fear. Joseph Goebbels, master of propaganda, made sure of it. His speeches painted the Red Army as a tide of barbarism that would wash away German civilization. Posters warned of atrocities. Newspapers repeated tales of cruelty. Even in cellars and shelters, the rumors spread faster than fire. The Russians were coming, and they would take everything. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers whispered of old wars, of Russia's endless armies, and of revenge that could not be stopped. That fear was not born from propaganda alone. Berliners carried a memory buried deep in their nation's past. In the 7 Years' War, nearly 2 centuries earlier, Russian soldiers had stormed through Prussia, humiliating Frederick the Great himself. Now, the successor to that empire, the Soviet Union, was at the gates once again. History seemed to be circling back with merciless irony. In the city's bomb shelters, someone scrawled words on a wall: "Lerne schnell Russisch." Learn Russian quickly. It was not meant as advice, but as a grim joke. Everyone knew what it meant. Survival now depended not on loyalty to Hitler, but on whether one could face the Red Army and live. In cafes, those few still standing, rumors swirled over cups of weak coffee substitutes. Some claimed the Soviets would burn the city to ash in revenge for what the Germans had done in the East. Others said Stalin would hand Berlin to the Americans just to mock Hitler's dream. But no matter the version, every story ended the same way, with Berlin consumed. This fear was not just military, it was cultural, existential. The Soviets represented the collapse of everything the Nazis had promised: order, superiority, destiny. To many Berliners, their arrival was not just the end of the war, it was the end of a world. In the bleak winter of 1944, when Berliners felt the walls of their world closing in, a spark of hope flickered from the west. News spread of the Ardennes offensive, the so-called Battle of the Bulge. German forces had thrown the Allies back, if only for a moment, and propaganda seized on it with desperate energy. Newspapers trumpeted a turning of the tide. Radio broadcasts echoed with promises of miracle weapons and renewed victories. For some Berliners, weary and hollow-eyed from nights spent in shelters, it was enough to believe, for a week, a month, that perhaps the Reich still had fight left in it. Crowds gathered around radios, clinging to every word as though it were oxygen. In apartments with broken windows patched by cardboard, neighbors whispered, "Maybe we can still win. Maybe Hitler has a plan after all." Goebbels fanned the flames relentlessly. His speeches, still laced with venomous confidence, spoke of destiny, of one last strike that would send the Allies reeling. To hear him, one might think Germany had regained its strength overnight. Even in the shattered streets of Berlin, swastika flags were draped from windows once more, not as symbols of triumph, but as fragile talismans against despair. But beneath the surface, the illusion frayed quickly. The most perceptive Berliners knew better. The Ardennes offensive had not reversed the tide. It had only delayed it. A few weeks of respite in the west bought nothing against the Soviet juggernaut in the east. And deep down, most Berliners sensed it. The laughter that followed radio announcements was thin, brittle, and short-lived. In the diaries of school teachers, shopkeepers, and widows, the words are the same. We cheered, but our hearts knew the truth. The city may have briefly convinced itself of salvation, but it was a dream woven out of smoke and fading echoes. The hope that came from the west was never real. It was a ghost, vanishing as soon as one tried to grasp it. While the people of Berlin clung to illusions, some within the German high command saw the truth with terrifying clarity. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff, and Reinhard Gehlen, head of military intelligence for the Eastern Front, read the reports, saw the numbers, and understood what was coming. The Red Army was massing along the Vistula River with a force so vast that it dwarfed anything Germany could throw against it. They warned Hitler urgently. The Ardennes gamble, they argued, had drained resources that were desperately needed in the east. If Berlin was to be saved, every available division, every tank and shell, had to be shifted eastward immediately. Delay meant destruction, but Hitler was unmoved. His world had shrunk into a hall of mirrors where only his voice mattered. To him, Soviet preparations were exaggerated, perhaps even a bluff. Heinrich Himmler reinforced the illusion, assuring his Führer that the Soviets could not possibly mount such an offensive. The words were comforting, but they were poison. The atmosphere in the Führer bunker reflected this delusion. Officers who spoke the truth found themselves shouted down, dismissed as defeatists. Maps were spread across the tables, with Hitler drawing arrows and circles in thick pencil strokes. Plans that existed only on paper. His belief in the superiority of the German soldier, in some last-minute miracle, blinded him to reality. Guderian, once fiery and outspoken, resorted to biting sarcasm in council meetings, but even that fell flat against the wall of Hitler's stubbornness. Gehlen, whose intelligence reports laid out the Soviet timetable almost to the week, could do nothing but watch as his warnings vanished into silence. This blindness was not just military, it was psychological. To admit the Red Army's strength was to admit the failure of the entire Nazi project, from the dream of Lebensraum to the fantasy of racial supremacy. For Hitler, denial was easier than truth, and so the warnings piled up, ignored, until they became irrelevant. Every moment wasted in those bunker debates was another step closer to Berlin's destruction. History would not pause for Hitler's illusions. The Soviet tide was already rising. Even as his generals pleaded for reinforcements in the east, Hitler's gaze shifted southward, to Hungary. Oil was the Reich's lifeblood, and without it, tanks sat idle, aircraft rusted on runways, and the war machine ground to a halt. To Hitler, the Hungarian oil fields were the key to survival. If they could be defended, perhaps Germany could buy time. Thus, he diverted precious panzer divisions away from the Vistula front, not to strengthen Berlin's defenses, but to launch a relief operation for Budapest. The city had been encircled by the Red Army since Christmas, its defenders trapped in a desperate fight among ruins not unlike those awaiting Berlin itself. Hitler was convinced that German armor could smash through the Soviet lines, rescue Budapest, and restore the Reich's dwindling supply of fuel. But the gamble was doomed from the start. The relief forces hurled themselves against the Soviet ring again and again, only to be beaten back with terrible losses. In February 1945, the last hope collapsed. Budapest fell, and with it went any chance of securing the oil lifeline. Soviet troops now stood deeper in Central Europe, while Berlin's eastern front lay perilously exposed. This was not strategy. It was desperation disguised as vision. By chasing oil in Hungary, Hitler squandered what little strength remained to him. The panzers that might have slowed the Soviet advance toward Berlin were instead reduced to wreckage in the fields outside Budapest. Meanwhile, ordinary Berliners paid the price. Each day, the artillery grew closer, the bombing heavier, and the food scarcer. They could not understand why their armies were fighting for distant Hungarian oil fields when the Red Army was nearly at their doorstep. But Hitler, locked in his bunker, still believed in miracles. The irony was bitter. The very resource he sought to protect, oil, had become an illusion. Without it, his armies were crippled, and in chasing it, he had stripped Berlin of the only defense it might have had. The diversion to Hungary was not just a failed campaign, it was a death sentence for the Reich. By the winter of 1945, the Red Army was no longer the battered force that had reeled back in 1941. It was a steel juggernaut, vast and relentless, rolling westward with a momentum that nothing in Europe could stop. Along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic, 6.7 million Soviet soldiers stood ready, an army larger than anything the world had ever seen. Their arsenal was staggering: 41,600 guns and mortars, 6,250 tanks and assault guns, and thousands of Katyusha rocket launchers that could saturate entire landscapes with fire. Overhead, 7,500 aircraft prepared to dominate the skies. Facing them were just 1 million Germans with dwindling supplies, 10,400 guns, 1,500 tanks, and an air force so weakened it could barely protect its own cities. The scale itself told the story. 4 years earlier, Germany had invaded the Soviet Union with 3 million men, the largest invading force in history. Now, in a cruel twist of fate, the Soviets came with more than double that number to deliver their vengeance. The wheel of history had turned full circle. But it was not only numbers that mattered. The Red Army had been tempered by unimaginable suffering. From the ruins of Stalingrad to the frozen forests of Kursk, Soviet soldiers had endured hardship that would have broken lesser armies. They were no longer the disorganized masses that German propaganda mocked in 1941. They were veterans, hardened, disciplined, and driven by a cause as personal as it was political: revenge. Every village burned, every family slaughtered, every humiliation suffered at German hands now fueled their advance. For them, the road to Berlin was not merely a military campaign. It was justice. The banners that hung above their camps bore not just slogans of communism, but vows of retribution. And their morale was soaring. Where Germans whispered of collapse, Soviets spoke of triumph. Where Berliners huddled in cellars, Soviet troops sang of victory. The psychological balance of the war had shifted completely. For Germany, the Red Army was a nightmare made real. For the Soviets, Berlin was the prize, the symbol of victory that would crown their suffering with glory. The storm was gathering, and soon it would break. Even as the Red Army amassed with crushing superiority, Hitler and his inner circle clung to illusions. In the bunker, facts were twisted into fantasies, and every sign of defeat was explained away, as if Germany still held the advantage. Hermann Göring, once the supreme commander of the Luftwaffe and now a shadow of his former self, offered one of the most absurd reassurances. Confronted with reports of overwhelming Soviet air power, thousands of planes ready to dominate the skies, he dismissed them outright. "They are not real planes," he scoffed, as if words alone could erase the roar of engines already darkening the horizon. But the truth was undeniable. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was broken. Its fuel reserves were nearly gone, its factories shattered by Allied bombing, and its pilots were boys rushed into cockpits with barely a handful of training flights. Against the Soviet air fleets, they were lambs sent to slaughter. This denial ran deeper than military assessments. It was a collective blindness. Hitler spoke of divisions that no longer existed, units that had been destroyed weeks earlier. Maps were covered with arrows of counterattacks that would never come. He believed in phantom armies, conjured more by will than by reality. And his generals, too fearful or too loyal, nodded silently. It was as though the entire leadership had retreated into a dreamscape where the Reich still commanded destiny. But outside the bunker, the truth was visible in every street. Rubble lay where theaters once stood, shells punched through apartment walls, and Berliners burned furniture for warmth. The delusion of victory inside the bunker stood in grotesque contrast to the despair of the city above. This chasm between reality and belief sealed Germany's fate. While Soviet artillery prepared to thunder, Hitler's court still played its strategy on maps that bore no resemblance to the battlefield. In those final months, Germany was no longer guided by strategy or reason, it was guided by denial, an empire willing itself into oblivion. As the Soviets closed in, Joseph Goebbels prepared what he called Berlin's last line of defense. It was not a professional army, it was the Volkssturm. 60,000 souls were drafted into this desperate force. Old men who had once fought in the Great War, women pressed into service, and children barely old enough to shave. Some were limping on crutches, others wore uniforms that didn't fit, and many had never fired a weapon in their lives. Their training was almost non-existent. Ammunition was so scarce that many carried only 5 rounds each, 5 bullets with which to hold back an empire. Weapons were mismatched, scavenged from depots or pulled from forgotten storerooms. Some clutched World War I rifles, others carried little more than Panzerfausts, one-shot anti-tank launchers handed out as if they were toys. Alongside them stood the Hitler Youth. Boys as young as 15 took up arms, their faces still soft with youth, their voices unbroken. Propaganda had filled their heads with tales of glory, of sacrifice for the Führer, but the reality was a nightmare. They were told to stop Soviet tanks with grenades and courage. For many, the war ended in moments. And then there were the remnants of the Waffen-SS, the fanatics who still believed in Hitler's vision, even as it crumbled around them. Hardened, merciless, and determined to fight to the last, they stood beside the untrained and the unready, their zeal a sharp contrast to the fear in the eyes of children and elders. Goebbels spoke of these people's soldiers as the spirit of the Reich, the embodiment of German will. But in truth, it was tragedy masquerading as heroism. Families watched sons march out with rifles far too heavy for their shoulders, knowing they would never return. Mothers sewed makeshift uniforms, pressing kisses onto cheeks that would soon be cold. Berlin had become a city where the line between soldier and civilian no longer existed. Every cellar, every school, every church was turned into a fighting post. The People's Army was not a sign of strength. It was the final proof of collapse. On January 12, 1945, under a heavy gray sky, the storm finally broke. At 5 in the morning, along the banks of the Vistula River, Soviet artillery opened fire. Thousands of guns thundered in unison, their roar shaking the frozen earth and lighting up the horizon with a flicker that turned night into day. It was the beginning of the Vistula-Oder offensive, the final great push toward Berlin. German defenses shattered almost immediately. The panzer reserves Hitler had ordered forward were caught in the open and annihilated by Soviet barrages before they could even deploy. Entire trenches were swallowed in minutes. Survivors stumbled back in confusion, their uniforms torn, their faces white with frost and fear. Through the smoke and snow came the Red Army's tanks, endless columns of T-34s, their engines roaring, tracks grinding the frozen ground into mud. Infantry swarmed behind them, soldiers in white winter coats moving like a tide over the land. In villages along the river, German units barely fired a shot before being overwhelmed. Resistance, where it existed, was swept aside in hours. What unfolded was less a battle than a collapse. The Vistula line, once imagined as Germany's shield, simply dissolved. Within 2 weeks, the Red Army had advanced nearly 500 kilometers, overrunning Poland entirely. Soviet banners flew in Warsaw, and their troops stood only 69 kilometers, 43 miles, from the gates of Berlin. For the soldiers who marched west, the offensive was not just a military operation. It was vengeance made real. They carried with them memories of families starved in the siege of Leningrad, comrades buried in the rubble of Stalingrad, and the endless graves of villages burned by German hands. Every step toward Berlin felt like repayment. In Berlin itself, word of the Soviet advance spread quickly. Rumors raced through the cellars. They are already in Poland. They are almost here. Some Berliners clung to denial, insisting that Hitler had a secret weapon, that some miracle would stop the Soviets. But most felt the chill of inevitability. The storm was no longer distant. It was coming straight for them, faster than anyone had believed possible. By late January 1945, the Red Army stood only 43 miles from Berlin. To many observers, it seemed inevitable that they would surge forward immediately and seize the German capital. But General Georgy Zhukov, commander of the First Belarusian Front, chose to pause. For a moment, the storm held its breath. The reason was not weakness, but caution. The Germans, desperate and cornered, launched counterattacks in Pomerania, hoping to strike at the exposed Soviet flanks. If Zhukov lunged straight at Berlin, he risked leaving his supply lines vulnerable to a blow that might delay victory. Instead, the Red Army turned northward, crushing these German thrusts before resuming its march toward the capital. But there was another reason, one that was more political than military. Joseph Stalin. For the Soviet leader, the capture of Berlin was more than a strategic necessity. It was a prize, a symbol of triumph over Nazism and of Soviet supremacy in Europe. And Stalin, ever suspicious, was determined that it would be Soviet soldiers, not the Western Allies, who planted their flags in the ruins of Hitler's capital. He set his commanders against one another in a race. Zhukov from the north, Ivan Konev from the south with the First Ukrainian Front, and Konstantin Rokossovsky further north with the Second Belarusian Front. Stalin stoked their rivalries, knowing that each man was eager for the glory of Berlin. To disappoint him was unthinkable. For the soldiers waiting in the frozen fields, the delay was agonizing. They could see Berlin within reach, but were told to hold, to prepare, to wait for the order. In the trenches, they spoke of the city as if it were already theirs, a shadow just beyond the horizon. Yet the commanders knew the truth. Taking Berlin would not be easy. Urban warfare was slow, brutal, and costly. The pause gave them time to stockpile ammunition, repair tanks, and ready themselves for the final push. For the Germans, the delay was both a reprieve and a curse. Every day gained allowed them to fortify Berlin, digging trenches, laying mines, converting cellars into bunkers. But it also deepened the despair of the civilian population, who now lived in suspended terror, knowing the Red Army was near but not yet here. When Zhukov finally gave the order in April, it would not be a cautious advance. It would be an onslaught designed not just to take a city, but to satisfy Stalin himself. The race for Berlin was about to begin. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army unleashed its final, most ferocious assault. The target was the Oder-Neisse line, specifically the Seelow Heights, Berlin's last natural barrier to the east. Whoever controlled this ridge would open the gates to the German capital. At 3 a.m, the night sky erupted. Nearly 1 million Soviet soldiers, backed by more than 20,000 tanks, guns, and rocket launchers, poured fire into German positions. To light their attack, Soviet engineers set up massive anti-aircraft searchlights, cutting through the mist like white blades. The effect was ghostly, an artificial dawn over the battlefield. But the haze of smoke and dust soon swallowed the light, turning it into a blinding fog that confused attackers as much as defenders. The Germans, though vastly outnumbered, fought with grim determination. 100,000 men and barely 1,200 tanks and guns held the ridge. From dugouts and trenches, they poured machine gun fire into the advancing Soviet lines. The Seelow Heights became a furnace, every hill scarred by explosions, every field churned into mud and blood. Zhukov pressed forward relentlessly. His orders were clear: breakthrough at all costs. By nightfall of the first day, the Soviets had gained ground, but at staggering expense. Waves of infantry advanced across open fields, only to be cut down by German fire. In 4 days of fighting, the Red Army lost 30,000 men, nearly triple the German casualties. Yet the tide was unstoppable. For the Soviet soldiers, each charge felt like a step closer to vengeance. For the Germans, each hour held back felt like another breath stolen from fate. Soldiers on both sides described the battlefield as hell itself: mud swallowing boots, bodies littering the fields, and the endless roar of artillery drowning out thought. On April 19th, the line finally broke. The Seelow Heights, battered and burned, could no longer hold. Soviet tanks poured through the breach, and the road to Berlin lay open. Zhukov had paid dearly in blood, but victory was his. Stalin, impatient and demanding, would have his race to the German capital. For Berlin, the countdown had begun. April 20th, 1945. Adolf Hitler turned 56. In another world, in another year, this day might have been celebrated with parades, banners, and orchestrated adoration. But in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, the birthday felt less like a celebration and more like a funeral. Above ground, Soviet artillery shells pounded the city relentlessly. Each explosion rattled dust from the bunker's ceiling, drowning out the sound of forced well-wishes. The Reich was collapsing, yet the Nazi hierarchy clung to ritual. A few loyal officers presented flowers, their stems drooping in the stale, airless room. Goebbels delivered speeches of devotion, his voice still sharp, but his eyes betraying exhaustion. The scene was surreal. As Hitler accepted the gifts, his hands trembled, his body weakened by years of illness and stress. His once piercing gaze had dulled into a vacant stare. The man who once commanded millions now seemed a shell, his empire reduced to rubble above him. Yet he still spoke of phantom divisions and impossible counterattacks, as if the war could be willed into victory by words alone. Outside the bunker, Berliners marked the day differently. For most, it was just another day of survival. Mothers huddled with children in cellars as artillery roared. Fires burned in the streets. Food lines stretched along bombed-out blocks. Few even knew or cared that it was the Führer's birthday. To them, the only gift that mattered was the chance to live another day. Yet there was symbolism in the timing. As Hitler turned 56, Soviet armies had already encircled his capital. Their gift was not celebration, but destruction, encirclement, bombardment, the noose tightening around Berlin. In the bunker, the birthday gathering ended quickly. The flowers wilted in the dim light, and the echoes of Goebbels' words faded into silence. Outside, the city burned. It was the last birthday Hitler would ever see. By April 22, 1945, Berlin was no longer a city fighting for survival. It was a city already surrounded. Soviet forces had closed the ring. From the north, Zhukov's First Belarusian Front pressed in. From the south, Konev's First Ukrainian Front advanced relentlessly. Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front cut off any hope of escape to the north. The trap was complete. Inside the bunker, Hitler's rage boiled into despair. He pounded the map table, shouting at generals for armies that no longer existed. He demanded that the 9th Army and the 12th Army, battered forces engaged elsewhere, turn and march to Berlin's rescue. The orders were impossible, bordering on delusional, but still they were issued. Couriers carried them into a battlefield that had already consumed the units in question. For the German people, the encirclement was both expected and terrifying. Shells rained on the city without pause. Entire districts were reduced to ash, landmarks crumbled, and columns of smoke rose so thick they darkened the sky. Civilians dug trenches in gardens, basements became hospitals, and cellars became tombs. Refugees clogged the streets, dragging carts and suitcases, not knowing where safety could possibly lie. And yet, amid the despair, small victories flickered. At Bautzen, German forces briefly pushed back the Soviets in a bloody engagement, a last gasp of tactical success. But these triumphs were illusions, ripples against a tidal wave. They could not alter the fate of the capital. Every day, the Soviets drew tighter. Berlin was cut off from the outside world. No food convoys entered, no reinforcements arrived, no messages of salvation came. The city was an island of ruin, left to face the full force of Stalin's armies. In the streets, the realization sank in. There would be no relief. The Reich's capital, once imagined as the heart of a 1,000-year empire, was now a fortress doomed to fall. And inside the bunker, Hitler, once master of Germany, had become its prisoner. On April 25th, the Soviets broke into Berlin itself. The war that had ravaged continents was now reduced to a brutal struggle for streets, squares, and cellars. The city, once the proud heart of the Reich, became a battlefield of shattered stone and flame. Every block was contested. German defenders mounted machine guns on apartment rooftops, turned attics into sniper nests, and positioned Panzerfaust teams in cellars. From the shadows of ruined churches and schools, they struck at Soviet tanks. It was a war fought not on open fields, but in stairwells, alleyways, and rubble heaps. The Soviets adapted with ruthless efficiency. Tanks hugged the edges of streets, their machine guns sweeping windows. Infantry advanced cautiously behind, flamethrowers ready to clear basements and bunkers. Anti-aircraft guns dragged into the city were turned downward, blasting German strongholds at close range. Whole apartment blocks collapsed under barrages from self-propelled artillery. For Berlin civilians, there was no escape. Families huddled in underground shelters as battles raged above, only to emerge into streets that no longer existed. Some tried to flee westward, but the encirclement was too tight. Others were trapped in their homes as soldiers fought through their staircases and courtyards. The city had become a labyrinth of death. The fighting recalled Stalingrad, but with one crucial difference: the Soviets had learned. They wasted no time with house-to-house duels when artillery could erase entire blocks. Progress was slow but steady, their losses heavy but sustainable. Berlin was being pounded into dust. For the Germans, it was a defense without hope. Each day the lines shrank, each night the Soviet artillery roared. Still, they fought, Hitler Youth clutching grenades, Volkssturm elders firing ancient rifles, SS units refusing to yield. Their resistance was not enough to win, but it was enough to turn the city into a graveyard. Berlin was no longer a capital. It was a ruin where history itself seemed to collapse, brick by brick, body by body. And with every street lost, the Reich edged closer to its end. By the final week of April, the struggle for Berlin narrowed to a single, towering prize: the Reichstag. Though no longer the seat of government since the Nazi rise to power, it stood as the symbolic heart of Germany, the building that had witnessed the Republic's birth, its burning, and now its impending fall. To Stalin, nothing mattered more than a Soviet flag flying above it. For the Red Army, this was more than a military objective. It was a race. Marshal Zhukov drove his men from the east, desperate to reach the Reichstag before his rival, Marshal Konev, advancing from the south. Stalin had set them against one another, promising glory to whichever front claimed the city's ruins first. The soldiers knew it too. Every step forward was fought not only against the Germans, but against time and their own comrades in rival commands. The approach to the Reichstag was a nightmare. Trenches, tunnels, and barricades ringed the area, manned by SS fanatics and desperate Volkssturm. The Soviets hurled themselves into the defenses, only to be cut down by machine guns hidden in moats and bunkers. Anti-tank ditches slowed their armor. Entire platoons were lost in minutes. Still, they pressed forward. Soviet artillery leveled block after block, blasting open paths at terrible cost. The smell of smoke and blood hung thick in the air. Veterans of Stalingrad muttered that this battle felt eerily familiar. Close-quarter fighting, house by house, but now with the added weight of symbolism pressing on every shot fired. For the defenders, there was no illusion. They knew the Reichstag was not a fortress. It was a shrine. Its defense was not about strategy but defiance, about holding out one more hour, one more day, so that history would remember their resistance. Young Hitler Youth, old Volkssturm, and hardened SS fighters poured their last strength into its walls. Every Soviet soldier who fought toward the Reichstag knew what was at stake. To plant the red banner, there was to declare the war in Europe finished, the sacrifice of millions avenged. It was not just conquest, it was vindication. On April 30th, as Soviet forces surged into the building's shattered halls, room-to-room combat erupted. Grenades echoed in the stairwells, machine guns rattled in the corridors. Amid the chaos, soldiers carried flags, desperate to be the first to raise them over the dome. Stalin's demand for symbolism had turned the Reichstag into a battlefield of legend. Berlin was collapsing all around it, but the world's eyes, Soviet, German, and soon Allied, were fixed on this one building. And soon, it would be crowned with the symbol of a new order. April 30th, 1945. In the labyrinth of the Führer bunker, the end finally came. Outside, Soviet artillery pounded the city with unrelenting fury, each shell a reminder that Berlin was hours, not days, from collapse. Inside, Adolf Hitler prepared to leave the stage he had dominated for over a decade. The night before, he had married Eva Braun in a quiet ceremony. She had followed him into the bunker willingly, a final act of loyalty. There were no celebrations, no music, only a simple exchange of vows witnessed by weary aides. Champagne was poured into chipped glasses, but the toast tasted hollow. Even in that moment of intimacy, the bunker smelled of smoke, sweat, and despair. By morning, Hitler gathered his inner circle one last time. His once fiery voice was now thin, almost resigned. He thanked them for their service, muttered words of loyalty and betrayal, and repeated that the German people had failed him. The dream of empire was gone, and with it, his will to live. At around 3 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva retreated into his private study. Those who remained outside, the secretaries, the guards, the generals, waited in heavy silence. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the bunker. When the door was opened, Hitler was slumped lifeless on the sofa, a pistol still in his hand. Beside him lay Eva Braun, her lips blue from cyanide. For those who witnessed it, the moment was surreal. The man who had driven the world into war, who had built an empire on terror and lies, was now reduced to a corpse in a dingy underground room. His body was hurriedly carried outside, doused in petrol, and set alight in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, even as shells fell around them. The flames rose briefly, a mockery of the bonfires that once marked Nazi triumphs. Reactions varied among those left behind. Some wept openly, clinging to their devotion even in ruin. Others felt only numbness, as though a weight had lifted. For many, it was not grief but a strange, hollow relief. The nightmare was ending, though it had consumed everything in its path. Above ground, the city still burned. For Berliners, Hitler's death meant little. They had no time for rituals or mourning. Survival was their only concern. Yet history would mark that day as the true end of the Third Reich. In that bunker, in that moment, the war had claimed not just a city, but the man who had unleashed it. With Hitler gone, Berlin's resistance unraveled. On May 1, 1945, Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag. The building, once the stage for Germany's political destiny, now stood in ruins, its stone walls scorched and broken. Inside, firefights raged from chamber to chamber, grenades echoing through stairwells, rifle fire rattling across marble floors. Finally, amid smoke and rubble, Soviet soldiers hoisted their banner high above the dome. The red flag fluttered against the blackened sky, an image that would become the symbol of Nazi Germany's defeat. Elsewhere in the city, the last acts of defiance collapsed into futility. Joseph Goebbels, fanatical to the end, refused surrender. That night, he and his wife poisoned their 6 children before taking their own lives. The bunker that had begun as the nerve center of empire had become a mausoleum of despair. On May the 2nd, General Helmuth Weidling, the final commander of Berlin's defense, accepted the inevitable. With barely 10,000 men left from the 300,000 once mustered, he ordered the garrison to lay down their arms. White flags appeared across the city. Soviet soldiers marched through streets littered with rubble and corpses, past civilians who watched in silence, their faces hollow with exhaustion. For Berliners, the end was not relief, but survival. Some wept, some collapsed in despair, and others simply stared at the ground, too numb to feel anything at all. The war had devoured their city, their homes, their families. Now it left them in ruins, uncertain what tomorrow would bring under their conquerors. For Europe, however, Berlin's fall marked the turning of an age. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was ending. Within a week, Germany would surrender unconditionally. Across the world, bells tolled and crowds cheered, but in Berlin there was only silence. The ruins of the Reichstag stood as a monument to hubris and destruction, crowned with a red flag. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12, and in its ashes, the world prepared to reckon with the cost. Tens of millions dead, entire nations scarred, and a continent forever changed. The Battle of Berlin was not just the end of Nazi Germany. It was the closing chapter of Europe's darkest night.